us want to make wise decisions. It helps us to have a better life. And so when, for example, you were trying to figure out which college you were going to go to, you did a lot of research, you looked at all the data, and you made a wise decision. And that is why you are here rather than Austin. But there is another decision that you will be called to make sometime in the future that is more important than the present one that you made in the university to attend. That decision will be, should you get married? And if you want to get married, who should you marry? And that is a tough decision. It's an important one. And I can tell you, when I went to college, I was really excited. I wanted two things. I wanted a good education, and I wanted to find a good wife. And the priority wasn't necessarily in that order. Now, I came from a family where my dad cheated on my mom, and so she divorced him, left him when I was 5, and she married my stepdad a few years later, and he was a good man. But he came from marriage, a divorce, because his wife had cheated on him. So I knew, based on those two, plus the fact that the divorce rate in the United States was so high, that marriage was not going to be one of the easiest things in life to do. So I wanted to make a good decision, a good choice about my spouse, and I knew I needed to get some wisdom on this. So when I went to college, I began asking married couples about what should I be looking for. Now, some married couples are going to be very happily married, and I'm saying, why do you think you made a good choice? What were you looking for? And then other married couples, they weren't so happy. And I'd say, tell me what you wish you had been looking for. What did you miss? Let me learn from your mistake. And so a lot of the same answers were given over that time. And by the time I finished my undergrad work, I took all those answers and I found, I could really put them into 5 different categories, which I came to call the 5 C's of complete compatibility. This relationship brought to you by the letter C. And then when I started grad school, then I got even more analytical. So when I'd ask a girl on a date, after the date, I would drop her off at her apartment, then I'd come home to my apartment and start a file on her. And so I had these 5 categories, and I'd list these 5 categories and how I thought we connected in each of them. Now, you can only know so much about a girl after one date. So I would put my impressions there, and I thought, okay, well, here's some other areas I need to investigate on. And so I'd write out questions or some way to kind of find out some things on our next date. And then after a few dates, even if I were developing some affection for her, if I didn't feel that we were connecting adequately, I stopped pursuing the friendship. And then I met Debbie, and 18 months later, we got married. And in a month and a half, it will be 38 years ago that we got married. Thank you. So there's value in getting wisdom in making decisions. But there's another decision that you're going to make in life that's even more important than the one about the selection of your spouse, and that is your worldview. Because your worldview is going to determine and influence you on how you are going to live your life. You're going to make a lot of decisions based on your worldview. And it's not only this life, but it could definitely have an impact on your eternity, what eternity is going to be like for you, where you're going to be. So it's really important. And I wanted to make the right decision because I figured I may only have one chance to get this right. Now, of course, if Buddhism or Hinduism is correct, I'm going to have many chances to get this right. But if Islam is correct and I'm a Christian, well, I'm in deep kimchi when I die. So I wanted to get this right. So how do you do this? So I looked, and Christianity, Jesus offered a test by which we could know that he is who he claimed. So he would do miracles, or he would confront his interlocutors. They would confront him and say, show us a sign, give us some evidence that you are who you are claiming to be, because he was making some really radical claims. And he basically said his resurrection would be that sign. So the bottom line is, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then he's a false prophet whom no rational person should follow. But if he did rise from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. And so that gives us something very serious to think about. But that test that Jesus gave about his resurrection is meaningless to us today unless we can actually test it. It's not a matter of just, well, he gave that test and only the people in his day could test it. I mean, well, that might be good for them, but it doesn't help us today. But can we test it today? So this is the thing I set out to do when I enrolled in a doctoral program. I said, I'm going to investigate that as a historian. I spent the first 2 years studying the philosophy of history, historical method, and I said, I'm going to apply this to the resurrection of Jesus. And then during that period of time, I figured, well, I need to subject this to unsympathetic experts. So you do that not only through peer-reviewed process with journal articles and things like that, but I wanted to get into debate. And so I decided that I'm going to debate some of the top skeptics out there today and see how they would respond to this. And so I've had like 37 public debates. Most of those have been on the resurrection of Jesus. And the more I've done it, the more I've become convinced that the resurrection actually happened. It's not because I'm any special or anything like that, because I'm not. I have an average IQ. My dad told me what it is. I'd share it with you, but I forgot the number. I am a gifted student, so in school when they gave me a C, it was a gift. I'm honest about this, I really am. So I got C's all the way up through college. I think my final GPA was 2.8. But I finally understood later on. I found I got ADD, and so there's some medication for that. It really helps. So anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some of my journey and what I learned. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is the practice of history. What do historians do and how does it work? Well, my friend here, she could tell us about that, but she's not on the mic, so I am, and I'm going to share it with you. So some preliminary issues is the practice of history, as Richard Evans at Cambridge, his professor of history there, says, doing history is like looking through a window. Okay, you're looking through a window into the past, and that window isn't always clear. A lot of times there's dirt and there's fog on it, and you can't see things clearly. And the reason being is because sources, and we're missing some things, and sometimes the sources, we don't know how much we can trust them, and sometimes the sources don't agree with one another. So some things are clear, some things aren't that clear. So the historian's objective is to arrive at an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. We're not looking for exhaustive accounts. We're not looking for something that we can say, this absolutely happened as it said. We're looking for an essentially faithful representation, an accurate gist of what occurred. And because none of us can get into a time machine and return to the past to verify our conclusions, we are looking for a description of the past that's probably true to various degrees, rather than we can be certain that it's true. Now, a lot of times in our present day, if we're looking at something in the past, but it's in the near past, we can get additional confidence because we have videos, we have audio recordings, we have all this kind of stuff. So we can get to things a little better than we can in the distant past. So the greatest hindrance to understanding the past is that historians have what are called horizons. And horizons are based on our race, our gender, ethics, nationality, our political, religious, and philosophical assumptions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attend, and the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. There's just no way around it. And all of us have these biases in our horizons. They're like a pair of sunglasses we put on, and each of our glasses are tinted a little differently. That's why in politics or in religion or whatever, we can all be looking at the same thing and arrive at radically different conclusions. It's not, I realize that as a Christian, when I'm embarked in this investigation on the resurrection of Jesus, I've got my own biases. I want it to be true. I want my faith to be confirmed. And I understood at that point that I was not exempt from that, and that this bias on my part definitely had the potential to compromise the integrity of my investigation. So if I really wanted to do an investigation, I had to put some kind of a check on my horizon. It's not just a matter of recognizing that I've got this problem. I had to take steps to work through it. But it's not just the Christian who has this challenge. It's everyone. Dale Allison is one of the most elite New Testament scholars in the world. He teaches at Princeton. And here's what he writes. Some we might think of as having no theological agenda are partly motivated by an animus against traditional Christian doctrine, which is in reality just another sort of theological agenda. The trite truth is that none of us is without philosophical bias or theological interest when we sit down to study Christian origins. I remember in one of my debates with Bart Ehrman, perhaps the most influential skeptical New Testament scholar in the world, and he accused me of bias, and I said, well, of course, yeah, Bart, I'm biased, but you're biased too. And he said, well, of course I am. I said, so what's your point? We're all biased, you know. Now, I've taken 5 steps in order to manage my bias and to put it in check. What have you done? So Chris Lorenz, he's a professor of philosophy of history and historiography he's a general historian. He's not in studying Jesus or religion or anything like that. He's just studying philosophy of history and history in general. And here's what he writes. A proper philosophy of history must elucidate the fact that historians present reconstructions of a past reality on the basis of factual research and discuss the adequacy of these reconstructions. At the same time, it must elucidate the fact that these discussions seldom lead to a consensus and that therefore pluralism is a basic characteristic of history as a discipline. We shouldn't be surprised then, since pluralism is that basic component of history, of even modern historical things, like you were telling us at dinner tonight, about some discrepancies in the accounts of, I forgot what it was now. About Gettysburg, yeah. And even you go back even something more recent, like the burning of the Reichstag in Munich, 1933. Some say it was the communists who did it. Some say it was the Nazis who did it. Historians we don't know. Some say one, some say the other, but we can't know for sure. So pluralism is a basic characteristic of history as a discipline. We don't require consensus. So in summary, in our preliminary issues here, all historians have biases, and a consensus of historians on a topic is often absent. Okay? Now, with that in mind, let's jump into the case for the resurrection of Jesus. Tonight, I'm going to construct a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus using 2 major building blocks: facts and method. Now, that's so simple that even those in Austin can understand. Let's start with the facts. And here, I'm going to focus on what we're going to refer to as historical bedrock. That's a term that Paula Fredrickson, she's not a Christian, she teaches at Boston University. She came up with that. I like this term because historical bedrock, she calls facts past doubting. Now, there are things that we look at, and some things are better attested than others, okay? So when we come to Jesus, his death by crucifixion is better. We've got better evidence for that than we have for his resurrection, all right? That's the way it is in history, in all of history. And so bedrock would be those that are so strong that virtually all historians would grant. They'd agree on this because the data is so compelling. So if a hypothesis cannot account for the historical bedrock, then that hypothesis needs to be revised or abandoned. So let's look at the bedrock when it comes to Jesus related to his fate. Here's a timeline. Most scholars today agree that Jesus was crucified in either April of the year 30 or April of 33. It's about 50-50. It really doesn't matter. I kind of lean toward 33, but 30 is a round number. Let's just go with that. It doesn't really matter. Then they say that the first gospel to be written was Mark, the Gospel of Mark, and Mark wrote between the years 65 and 70. Some scholars go later, some go earlier than that, but the vast majority say between the years 65 and 70. Then they say Matthew and Luke wrote between the years 70 and 85, and John somewhere between the years 90 and 95. Now again, some scholars disagree with this. I'm not saying this is correct. We just don't know for sure. You know, good arguments can be made, I think, for before, but we just don't know. This is where the vast majority hold today. All right? Now, I want to focus on that period between when Jesus was crucified and when the first gospel, Mark, was written. All right? Now, why is that? We'll get into that in a little, but here's the thing. If we can establish a number of this historical bedrock that occurred before the Gospels were written, then any kind of objections that one might give to the Gospels, such as, it's common for skeptics to say, we don't know who wrote them, they're biased, they contain contradictions, they were written too long after the events they purport to describe, they weren't written by eyewitnesses. I'm not saying those things are true, but those are the things skeptics will raise. But all of those are irrelevant if we can establish these things from sources that predate the Gospels. So let's look at some things. There was a guy named Paul, and there's like 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. And of those 13 letters, the vast majority of scholars today, critical scholars, will say Paul wrote at least 7 of those. And then they're split 50-50 on 2 of them. And then the remaining 4, the majority of scholars say they don't think Paul wrote those. They think maybe one of his students or someone else wrote those. All right, I'm not here to say whether he did or not. We'll just focus to make things real simple and to make other things irrelevant. I'm just going to focus on those sources that everyone agrees Paul wrote. Okay? Now, one of those letters that he wrote that everyone agrees he wrote is Paul's letter to the church in Galatia. It's called Galatians in our New Testament. And Paul in there in chapter 1 says that 3 years after his conversion, and most scholars think Paul converted to Christianity. By the way, he'd been out persecuting Christians. He was a Pharisee, a leader in of the Jews in Jerusalem. And he's out persecuting Christians, and he's arresting them. He's consenting to their execution for being Christian. And then one day, according to Paul and his own letters, while he's persecuting Christians, he has an experience that he believes is an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And that experience radically transforms his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Okay, so this is pretty interesting stuff. So anything he's writing, it's not because he was a biased Christian to think this. It was precisely the opposite. He was biased against the Christians to a point where he was arresting them and persecuting them. Now, Paul says that 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and he met with Peter, the lead apostle, and he also saw James, the brother of Jesus. And so we can imagine what were they talking about? Well, of course, he's meeting with him. He's like, Pete, I wasn't with Jesus during his time. I knew some of the things he was teaching, but tell me, what was it like to be with him? Pete, I heard you walked on water. Is that true? Pete, did he really raise people from the dead and give sight to people born blind? And he's getting the whole 9 yards from Peter, who had been there. And again, he saw James, the brother of Jesus. Now, this is Paul, firsthand testimony saying this in one of his undisputed letters. Now, I know that maybe you're thinking, well, that's the Bible. We can't try. I'm not a Christian. I don't believe the Bible. But I want you to step back for a moment and try to look at this as a historian. And if you can do that and you say, here's a guy persecuting the church who becomes a Christian because he says the risen Jesus appeared to him, and he's meeting with the lead Christian, Peter, the leader of the church at that point, and James, the brother of Jesus. This is huge, historically speaking. In fact, Bart Ehrman, I mentioned him a moment ago, here's what he says about it. Paul was personally acquainted with Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, and Jesus' own brother, James. These are two good people to know if you want to know anything about the historical Jesus. I wish I knew them. So even Ehrman agrees, we've got some pretty cool source here. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that 14 years later, he goes back up to Jerusalem. Why? He says, I met with the pillars of the church. That's the term he used, the pillars of the church, and he names them Peter, James, and John. So it's the second meeting with Peter and James, and now he's meeting with John, the son of Zebedee, another of Jesus' three closest disciples. So you have two of Jesus' three closest disciples and Jesus' brother he's meeting with. That's pretty amazing. Peter, James, John, and Paul. And they're talking, and Paul says the reason he wanted to run the gospel message past them that he had been preaching to make sure that he hadn't been working in vain all these years. He wanted to make sure that what he was preaching is what they were preaching. And Paul said, they added nothing to my message. They gave me the right hand of fellowship. In other words, fist bump, Paul. You're a good brother. Keep up the good work. Now, for all we know, we got to ask as historians, was Paul telling the truth? I mean, he could say he was, but was he really? Well, here we want to look at some people who knew Peter and John. And so there's some guys called the Apostolic Fathers. I don't know why they call them the Apostolic Fathers. They were church leaders who came after the apostles, but they knew the apostles. And one of these guys' name was Clement of Rome, and Clement of Rome, was probably a disciple of the apostle Peter. And then a guy named Polycarp was probably a disciple of the apostle John. And so we want to see what they wrote. Well, Clement places Paul on par with his mentor Peter, and he refers to Paul as the blessed Paul. And then Polycarp says that, and I quote, Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And then he quotes from one of Paul's letters and refers to it as part of the sacred scriptures. Now, they're both writing this after Paul is dead. These aren't the kinds of things you'd write about Paul if he had been lying and teaching a gospel message different from what Peter and John were. It's precisely the kind of things we would expect if Paul had been telling the truth. I could give you some more information on this, but that should be sufficient, that when we are hearing Paul on the gospel message, we're likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. Now, wouldn't it be cool if we found a lost letter of Paul? Now, we know Paul wrote some other letters we don't have. In 1 Corinthians, he said, I previously wrote to you. I wrote to you. So we know he wrote another letter to the church at Corinth that we don't have. In Colossians, he says, read my letter that I wrote to the church of Laodicea. What? What letter to the church at Laodicea? That's not in our New Testament. Well, what if we found one of those letters and it said, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. It's like, whoa, that'd be historical gold. Because apart from the Gospels, we wouldn't need that. We could know from this what the Jerusalem apostles who had actually walked with Jesus, in a nutshell, what they were saying about the gospel message. Well, we don't need a lost letter of Paul. We actually have one of his undisputed letters that says that, and it's 1 Corinthians. And in there, Paul says, now I want to remind you, brethren, of the gospel message I preached to you. And he's going to give this to us. Now, he starts off, he says, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He says, I delivered to you what I also received. Now, these were two technical terms used for the imparting of oral tradition. Back in antiquity, only 10 to 20% of the people could read and write, and about half of those could read, and only about half of those could write. So the way people learned was through oral tradition, oral storytelling. And it's not like today you play the game of telephone, where you whisper someone and it goes to the back and you get a different story. They had ways, controls to make sure that these stories stayed intact. And they had people who would ensure this kind of stuff. It's a whole thing to get into. It's kind of really interesting. So this is oral tradition that he's given to them. What I delivered to you, what I also received. Now, when did he deliver to them? Most scholars agree that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians somewhere between the years 52 and 57. So he delivered it to them when he established the church in Corinth, the First Baptist Church of Corinth. And most scholars believe that he did that in the year 51. So he delivered it to them in 51, what he received beforehand. No later than the year 50, of course, and probably even before then. We don't know when. He doesn't tell us. And there's numerous opportunities he could have received it. He could have received it immediately upon his conversion. He could have received it when he went to see Peter 3 years later, or 14 years, or in between and afterward. He was with apostles doing like Silas and Barnabas on their missionary journeys. He could have received it during any of that time, but he's getting it from one of the other apostles from Jerusalem. So here's what this oral tradition says that goes back to the Jerusalem apostles. Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. Notice it's long, short, long, short. That was there to assist in memorizing. And then he's got the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus. And then he provides a list to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500 at one time. And Paul adds, most of these people are still alive, although some have died. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. And then Paul adds his own name to the list. Notice you got 3 individual appearances, and notice who they are. Peter and James, whom he met with twice, so he gets it from them. And Paul, his own eyewitness testimony. And then you got 3 group appearances. Those are important. We'll get to those in a moment. And then Paul says, whether I or they, that is the other apostles, this is what we preached and this is what you believe. So we know from Paul in this oral tradition, we can know with certainty, something that historians don't often get, but we can know with certainty that the disciples of Jesus, those who had walked with him, were out preaching that he had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. That's pretty cool stuff. But we can go further. We've got numerous reports from antiquity that these disciples were willing to suffer intense persecution and even willing to die for their gospel proclamation. Now, some of those reports are kind of unbelievable, to be honest with you. They come later, and we know from other reports from Jewish martyrs that there was a tendency at times to be able to amplify or embellish those accounts, to glorify the martyr, or to maybe give confidence to others who may be put in a similar situation. But the early reports are usually unadorned. So we've got 5 reports from the 1st century alone that talks about how these disciples were persecuted and how some even endured martyrdom. So why is that important? Let me go back to that. Why is that important? This doesn't prove that what the disciples were claiming is true, but it strongly suggests that they believed what they were proclaiming is true. It's like even Muslim jihadis who die in jihad. They do it because they believe what they believe Islam is true. Even Christians who die at the hands of these jihadis by being beheaded, they're dying as martyrs for what they believe to be true. But with the Muslim, it's like, for all we know, what we believe could be false. It's possible, it's false. We don't know for sure, we're believing it by faith. But you wouldn't accuse the Christian martyr or the Muslim martyr of, well, they know what they believe, what they're saying is false. It's like, you don't walk into Al-Qaeda and say, hey, what do you want me to do? Oh, go strap a bomb on your back and go blow up these people. Let's see, Muhammad was a false prophet, the Quran is not from God, and if I kill all these people, innocent people, I'll go to hell. Sign me up. That's not what's going on. They really believe it's true. The disciples, willing to suffer and die, show that not only were they proclaiming Jesus rose and from the dead and appeared to them, they truly believed it. And there is a difference between Christians and Muslims who die today for what they believe in the disciples. We may endure persecution and die for what we believe is true, but we can only say we believe it. They were dying for what they knew was true or knew was false. Liars make poor martyrs. The disciples were not only proclaiming he rose from the dead, they actually believed it. So immediately we can rule out that they were lying. Okay? What do they mean by resurrection? Well, let me show you just a couple things. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. To be asleep was a euphemism then to say you're dead. It's like today we say he passed away rather than saying he croaked. Back then you say he fell asleep and went to be with his forefathers. The first fruits, what that means, you had the Jews and the Christians, they believed in what's called the general resurrection. On the day God comes to judge the world, all the dead are going to be raised, they're going to be judged, some will go into damnation, some will go to eternal life. Okay, so that's the general resurrection. What Paul is saying here is Christ is the first to be raised in the general resurrection with an immortal body. When are the rest going to be raised? My parents are both dead. They both were followers of Jesus. When are they going to be raised? Christ. When are we going to be raised if we die before he returns? Paul answers that 3 verses later. Each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then those who belong to Christ at his coming will be raised when Jesus returns. All right. Now, with that in mind, see what Paul, so the thing here is we're going to be raised as Christ was raised. He's the first fruits, we're coming later. We're going to be raised as Christ was raised. So now look what Paul says in Romans, and this is another of Paul's undisputed letters. He says, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. He raised Christ's mortal body, he will raise our mortal body. So resurrection was a physical bodily event. In Romans 8:23, just a few verses after that previous verse, he says, when Christ returns, we will experience the redemption of our bodies. So it's a physical thing. Another thing, the apostles meant for Jesus' resurrection to be understood as a historical event. It has been common for skeptical scholars over the years to say, well, it was just a metaphor. It's just resurrection was a metaphor to say Jesus' teachings still live on. But that doesn't really work. Paul makes the statement in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, look, if the dead are not raised, then Christ was not raised. And if Christ was not raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins, then also those who have died in Christ have perished. And then he goes on, he says, look, if I fought wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Get all the ice cream you want. Take weed, cheat on your test. Get all the sex you want. Do whatever you want now. Live for today because there's no tomorrow, Paul says, if Christ was not raised. So remember, he's undergoing all kinds of persecution. A few verses earlier, he says that he's under the threat of death on a daily basis for preaching the gospel. Why do that if Christ was not raised and this life is all there is? So his argument is, if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, the Christian life is not worth living. But Christ was raised, therefore we will be raised, therefore the Christian life is worth living. And that argument makes no sense if they meant by the resurrection it was just a metaphor. So, our 6 facts. Jesus died by crucifixion. A number of his disciples had experiences they interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them. They claimed the risen Jesus appeared to groups. Paul had an experience he interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. The apostles believed Jesus was raised bodily, physically from the dead, and the apostles believed the resurrection of Jesus was a historical event. These are pretty much undisputed by scholars today, these 6 facts. So what do we do with these? This brings to the second major building block. What we could rule out, it wasn't a legend that developed over time because it can go back to the eyewitnesses. They weren't lying. They really believed it. They understood it as bodily, physical, and it was not a metaphor. So that brings us to method now. And this is really short. I could spend a whole lot of time with this, but I'm going to make it really short. All right, so you got the tools of the trade that historians use. And one of those would be explanatory scope. So think of a jigsaw puzzle. And I want you to think of each of the jigsaw puzzle pieces as a historical fact. So what historians do is they try to take these puzzle pieces and form a puzzle solution that you're able to use all the puzzle pieces. If you can come up with a hypothesis and you can include all of the known facts, then that puzzle, that solution, that hypothesis has a much better chance of being correct than if you have to leave some of those facts orphaned because your hypothesis cannot account for those. So, with that in mind, let's look at the resurrection hypothesis. Does it account for Jesus' death by crucifixion? Sure. Does it account for the appearances to the apostles? Or let's say this, they had experiences they perceived or interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them. Absolutely. What about their claims that he had appeared to them in groups? Yep. What about a skeptic, a persecutor of the church, Paul, converting to Christianity because he believed Jesus rose and appeared to him? Yep. Would it account for why they perceived this as a physical resurrection? Yep. And why they thought it actually occurred? Of course. So we can see the resurrection hypothesis does a beautiful job of explaining the historical bedrock. Now let's look at one other hypothesis. There's a number of others, but I'm only going to take the one that is the most popular one held by skeptical scholars today, and that is the hallucination hypothesis. Now the hallucination hypothesis, we have to acknowledge, it sounds plausible. I mean, multiple studies by professionals have been done on hallucinations for more than a century, and they have found that about 50% of those grieving the loss of a loved one experience a hallucination of some sort. But there's all kinds of hallucinations. Visual hallucination, auditory hallucination, olfactory, gustatory hallucination, a hallucination where you feel a sense of motion, like we've all had an experience where we're dreaming and we have this dream, we're falling and we wake up. That is called a kinesthetic hallucination, sense of motion. Or remember when you got your first cell phone and you came into a meeting like this and you put it on vibrate and stuck it in your pocket, and in the middle you thought you felt it and you pulled it out and nobody loves me. That is called a tactile hallucination, a sense of feel. So what mental health professionals have found is when we experience a hallucination, we do so in a single mode. Maybe we see something, but we don't hear it. Or we hear something, but we don't feel it. The only 2 exceptions of that are people high on drugs and those schizophrenics. Okay? Other than that, we experience hallucinations in a single mode. What they also find is that hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. It's a false sensory perception. You believe you're perceiving something that isn't really there. You're seeing something, but that's not really there. It's going on in your mind. And so because of that, it's like a dream. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. Now, she might dream that she's in Maui. I might dream I'm in Maui, but we're not having the same dream. If I gave all of us a sleeping pill, and you're all volunteering, I give you all a sleeping pill. I said, let's all go to sleep and dream we're in Maui. Now, not all of us would have a dream that we're in Maui. And even those of us who did, when we talked about those dreams, they wouldn't be the same dream. So it's like, that's the same way with hallucinations. And so you can have groups experience a hallucination, but it's not the same hallucination. And not everyone in the group is going to have is going to hallucinate. So now, with that in mind, I want you to, does the hallucination hypothesis account for Jesus' death by crucifixion? Yes. Why? Because it would take something like Jesus' death to be an impetus for their grief that would bring on the hallucination. So yeah, that does it. Does it account for the appearances? No, and here's why. Only 7% of those who experience a grief hallucination has a visual hallucination. Our early reports tell us it was not 7%, but an unthinkable 100% for a hallucination. That doesn't work. Okay? What about the groups? Nope, that doesn't work either. Because remember, groups can't experience that kind of hallucination, a collective hallucination where 100% of the people in the group experience the same hallucination. So that doesn't work. What about the appearance to Paul? No, Paul was not grieving over Jesus' death. He believed Jesus was a failed prophet and a false Messiah. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. Would it account for him, the physical appearance? No, because when you have a hallucination of a person, you're probably thinking of them in kind of more of a spirit form. When my mom died in 2013, my dad died the next year, but before he died, he called me and he said that he saw my mom. He woke up in the middle of the night and saw my mom in a chair. She was kind of glowing and was in the bedroom. He was experiencing what I think would be a visual hallucination, okay? But I can tell you, my dad would not have thought that if he'd gone to her grave and dug it up, that her skeleton would have been gone, her corpse would have been gone. You know, a hallucination of a deceased person doesn't lead to the belief that that person was raised physically from the dead. And what about, would it lead them to believe it was historical? Well, I think we could give that a green light. They would still believe Jesus was raised, but they would say raised in spirit. He would have been raised. He was still alive and had appeared to them. So, but even being generous with that, you can look at that and say, when you compare the hallucination hypothesis with the resurrection hypothesis is the clear winner. And folks, that's the number one alternative hypothesis offered by non-believing scholars. That's the leading one, and that's how it compares to the resurrection hypothesis. So the bottom line is you got the resurrection hypothesis is by far the best explanation of the historical facts, the historical bedrock. When you do the same kind of exercise with other hypotheses, whatever they are, the resurrection comes out on top every time. So just from the historical bedrock, we've eliminated hallucination, metaphor, lies, legend, and I think there was one other, but I forgot what it was. So, but you can see it's pretty good. So I hope that encourages you. And what I think is pretty cool about this is when you look at this, yes, we still have to have faith. Anybody with any worldview still has to have faith that that worldview is true. It doesn't matter what it is, because again, none of us can get into a time machine and return to the past. But I think what this can show us is that believing as a Christian, we got some good evidence. We got some really good evidence for the foundation of our beliefs. And that means that God loves us. It means that he will be with you if you ask him to. If you want him and you want to become one of his followers and buy into what he's doing, Jesus will guide you. He answers prayer. He'll guide you to a spouse if you ask him to. It's a good thing. And but most importantly, eternal life. So I hope that helps, and let's go with the Q&A now.